He stood just 5'4", barely 130 pounds, wearing a baseball cap and aviator sunglasses, looking more like a kid chasing a movie dream than a Marine at war. Yet on the burning cliffs of Saipan in 1944, that teenager walked alone toward caves packed with enemy soldiers who had sworn never to surrender. Armed with nothing but broken street Japanese and a bluff bold enough to rewrite doctrine, Guy Gabaldon didn't just defy death, he changed how wars could be fought. The street kid from East Los Angeles. Before he ever faced enemy fire on a Pacific island, Guy Gabaldon was fighting a different kind of war on the cracked sidewalks of East Los Angeles. Born the fourth of 7 children in a poor Mexican-American family, he learned early that survival was not guaranteed. By the age of 10, he was shining shoes on Skid Row, weaving through gamblers, drifters, and night workers who paid in loose change and hard lessons. The streets were loud, unforgiving, and diverse. Irish dock workers, black laborers, Japanese shopkeepers, Mexican mechanics. If you wanted to last, you had to understand everyone. And Guy did. He was small, barely more than a shadow among older boys, but he was sharp. He joined multiracial neighborhood gangs not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Protection meant belonging. Belonging meant power. In those alleys, he discovered something more valuable than muscle. He learned how to read faces, how to sense fear, how to talk his way out of trouble. Words became currency. Confidence became armor. Long before he carried a rifle, he carried himself like someone who refused to be cornered. What no one on those streets could have guessed was that this restless kid was quietly preparing for history. The same survival skills that kept him alive in Los Angeles would one day keep hundreds alive in war. The same small frame that made him easy to overlook would allow him to slip through places others feared to tread. In a world that measured strength by size and status, Guy Gabaldon was building a different kind of power. And when the fires of World War II reached across the Pacific, the boy from Skid Row would step into them not as a victim of circumstance, but as a force history had underestimated. The Nakano family learning the language of the enemy. At 12 years old, Guy Gabaldon made a decision that would quietly alter the course of his life. He left the chaos of the streets and moved in with the Nakano family Japanese Americans who lived in the heart of Boyle Heights. It was an unlikely arrangement. A Mexican-American street kid taken in by an immigrant family whose ancestral homeland would soon be at war with the United States. But inside that modest home, something extraordinary began to take shape. The Nakano household was disciplined but warm. Meals were shared. Respect was expected. Laughter was common. Guy was no longer just surviving day to day. He was learning structure, patience, and belonging. The Nakano twins became his brothers. Their parents treated him not as an outsider, but as family. And in the small kitchens and storefront conversations of Little Tokyo, he absorbed more than vocabulary. He learned street-level Japanese direct, unscripted, alive. Not the polished language of diplomats, but the living language of shopkeepers, dock workers, and mothers calling their children home at dusk. What makes this chapter so powerful in hindsight is its irony. The culture he embraced would soon be branded enemy. The language he learned in friendship would later echo across volcanic cliffs in wartime negotiation, when history hardened into lines of battle. Guy carried something no training manual could provide: emotional fluency. He understood how Japanese families thought, feared, and loved. That understanding would one day pierce through propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. In that quiet home in Los Angeles, long before Saipan and before the roar of artillery, a foundation was laid. Not of hatred, but of empathy. Not of division, but of connection. And when the world split apart in war, the bond formed in the Nakano household would become the most unexpected weapon in the Pacific theater. Pearl Harbor, separation, suspicion, and a dangerous lie. On December 7, 1941, the world Guy Gabaldon knew shattered with the roar of planes over Pearl Harbor. Overnight, neighbors became suspects. Flags were lowered. Radios crackled with anger. And in the quiet living room of the Nakano family, fear settled like dust no one could sweep away. Within months, the United States government ordered Japanese American families into internment camps. The Nakano family, the people who had fed him, sheltered him, and treated him like a son, were forced onto trains under armed guard. Guy watched them disappear behind barbed wire, labeled a threat to the very country they called home. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than politics. It was personal. The nation he believed in had turned on the people he loved. At 17, restless and furious, Guy made a choice that would define him. He enlisted in the Marine Corps, but he carried a secret. He told recruiters he was fluent in Japanese. It was not entirely true. He did not speak textbook grammar or military dialect. What he had was street Japanese, rough and imperfect, learned in kitchens and alleyways. Still, it was enough. Enough to get him into language training. Enough to place him on a path toward the Pacific. In that moment, history bent in a way no one noticed. A Mexican-American teenager shaped by poverty and loyalty to a family, now imprisoned by his own government, prepared to fight a war against the country of their ancestors. It was not hatred that drove him. It was something more complicated. A need to prove himself. A need to reconcile loyalty and injustice. A need to step into a conflict larger than any street corner in Los Angeles. When he shipped out for the Pacific, Guy Gabaldon carried more than a rifle. He carried memory. He carried anger. And he carried a language that would soon test whether war had to mean annihilation or whether one voice could still break through the noise of propaganda and fear. Saipan, when the gates of hell opened. On June 15, 1944, the horizon off Saipan erupted in smoke and steel. Battleships thundered. Landing craft slammed into coral reefs. Young Marines waded through surf thick with gunfire, stepping into what commanders had warned would be one of the bloodiest assaults in the Pacific. Among them was an 18-year-old private from East Los Angeles, small in frame, baseball cap, pulled low aviator sunglasses on his face as if he were stepping onto a movie set instead of a battlefield. Saipan was not just another island. It was a strategic turning point. From its airfields, American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. Whoever held Saipan would hold the future of the war in the Pacific. And the defenders knew it. Hidden artillery ripped into the beaches. Mortars fell before the first defensive lines could even be formed. The sand became a landscape of chaos, smoke, and screaming metal. Guy Gabaldon did not look like the image of a war hero. At 5'4", barely 130 pounds, he blended into the background. But behind those sunglasses was a mind constantly assessing, observing, calculating. While others focused on firepower, he focused on terrain and human behavior. The Japanese had carved the island into a fortress of caves and tunnels. Each cave was more than a bunker. It was a psychological stronghold shaped by a code that taught death before surrender. In the days after the landing, Gabaldon began volunteering for reconnaissance near those caves, not charging blindly, not shouting threats, watching, listening, calling out in Japanese to unseen figures in the dark. His fellow Marines were skeptical. Most believed no Japanese soldier would ever come out alive. Yet this young private understood something they did not. War was not just about bullets. It was about belief. On Saipan, amid artillery and flame, history was shifting. The Pacific Campaign was entering a phase where sheer firepower would no longer be enough. And somewhere between the volcanic rock and the crashing surf, a street kid turned Marine was about to challenge one of the war's most dangerous assumptions, that every enemy had to be destroyed to be defeated. The lone wolf who broke the rules. War runs on discipline, orders, chain of command. And on Saipan, disobedience could mean court-martial or worse. But a few nights after the landing, while most Marines dug into defensive lines and braced for another wave of attacks, Private Guy Gabaldon slipped away from camp without permission. It was not recklessness. It was instinct. He moved toward the dark mouths of the caves where Japanese soldiers were believed to be hiding. Other units cleared caves with flamethrowers and grenades. That was standard procedure. Gabaldon tried something different. He stepped close enough to be heard and called out in Japanese. Not formal phrases, not rehearsed commands. Street language, direct, human. He told them they were surrounded, told them the fight was finished, told them surrender meant food, water, survival. The first time, 3 soldiers emerged. One reached for his weapon, and Gabaldon fired. The other 2 dropped theirs and walked out with their hands raised. He marched them back to camp alone. His commanding officer was furious. Leaving post during active combat was a serious offense. Court-martial was mentioned. But the next night, Gabaldon did it again. This time he located a guarded cave, eliminated the sentry, tossed a grenade deep enough to shake confidence, but not collapse the entrance, and then shouted in Japanese that American forces had the area locked down. 50 men walked out. 50. That was not luck. That was a crack forming in a belief system the Marine Corps thought unbreakable. Captain John Schwab stopped talking about punishment. Instead, he authorized Gabaldon to operate independently. A lone wolf, no squad, no radio, no backup. Just a carbine, a handful of grenades, and a voice that carried into darkness. Other Marines fought with fire and steel. Gabaldon fought with nerve and psychology. He understood something the manuals did not yet teach. When propaganda tells a soldier that surrender means torture and death, someone has to step forward and contradict it face to face. Each night he returned with more prisoners. 10, 15, 20 at a time. Word began spreading among Guinea's holdouts about the small Marine who spoke their language and kept his promises. On an island soaked in blood, trust became the most dangerous weapon of all. By breaking the rules, Gabaldon was quietly rewriting them. Not through rank, not through authority, but through results that no one could ignore. Bushido Banzai and the Cliffs of No Return. By early July 1944, Saipan was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a collision of belief systems. American strategy relied on firepower and logistics. Japanese doctrine leaned on something older, deeper, and far more uncompromising. The Bushido Code demanded loyalty unto death. Capture was disgrace. Surrender was shame carried beyond the grave. When American forces tightened their hold on the island, Japanese commanders ordered a massive, final assault. Before dawn, thousands of soldiers charged in what became one of the largest banzai attacks of the Pacific War. Rifles, bayonets, swords, even bare hands. It was not a tactical maneuver, it was a declaration. If they could not win, they would die standing. The attack lasted for hours. When the sun rose fully, the ground was covered with bodies. Yet the tragedy did not end there. Survivors retreated north toward Marpy Point and the volcanic cliffs overlooking the sea. Civilians followed. Rumors had spread that Americans would torture them, desecrate families, show no mercy. Fear moved faster than fact. Then came the unthinkable. Families climbed to the edge. Mothers holding children. Elderly men leaning on canes. Soldiers guiding civilians upward, not to safety, but to silence. Many chose to leap into the crashing surf below rather than face surrender. Guy Gabaldon saw the aftermath. Bodies along the shoreline. Personal belongings scattered in volcanic sand. It was a scene that hardened some Marines, but it unsettled him in a different way. He understood where that fear came from. He had lived in a Japanese household. He knew the cultural weight of honor. He knew the power of propaganda. At Bonsai Cliff, hundreds of desperate soldiers and civilians now hid in cave systems carved into black rock. They were armed. They were wounded. They were prepared to die. For most units, the solution was simple. Flamethrowers, explosives, collapse the caves and move forward. But Gabaldon stood at the base of those cliffs with a different realization. If Bushido demanded death over surrender, then someone had to redefine surrender itself. Not as humiliation, not as betrayal, but as survival. History remembers the gunfire of Saipan. It remembers the scale of the Banzai charge. What it rarely remembers is that in the shadow of those cliffs, one Marine was preparing to challenge not just soldiers, but an entire philosophy of war. At 7:30 a.m. on July 8, 1944, the air over Banzai Cliff was already heavy with heat and silence. Below the volcanic rock face stood an 18-year-old Marine, 5'4", 130 pounds, holding an M1 carbine and 4 grenades. Above him, inside the dark cave openings carved into the cliff, were hundreds of armed Japanese soldiers and civilians who had survived the Banzai charge. They were wounded, desperate, and prepared to die. Guy Gabaldon did not have artillery. He did not have a flamethrower unit. He did not have a radio to call for support. What he had was a decision. Instead of advancing with force, he chose audacity. He turned to 2 Japanese prisoners he had captured the day before. He told them they were going back up the cliff. They would enter the caves and deliver a message. The fighting was over. American warships offshore could flatten the cliffs. Bombers were overhead. Resistance meant certain death. Surrender meant food, water, medical care, no torture, no execution. The prisoners stared at him as if he had lost his mind. Maybe he had. Gabaldon watched as they climbed the narrow path toward the caves. He stayed below alone on open ground fully exposed. If the soldiers inside chose to open fire, He would have seconds at most. If they rushed him, there would be no escape. Minutes passed. No gunfire. No movement. The morning felt endless. Then a figure appeared at a cave entrance. One soldier, unarmed, then another, then 5 more. They moved slowly down the cliff path with their hands visible. Gabaldon raised his carbine ready for deception, but the men kept walking. More figures emerged. 10, 20, 50. The bluff was working. From the base of the cliff, Gabaldon shouted instructions in Japanese. Form a line. Sit down. Separate soldiers from civilians. Separate wounded from able-bodied. His voice carried authority far beyond his rank. The number kept growing. 100, 200, 300. He realized the danger had shifted. He was no longer confronting enemies inside caves. He was standing alone in front of a swelling crowd of armed men who could overwhelm him at any moment. If even a fraction changed their minds, he would be dead before he could fire twice. And still, he held his ground. This was no longer just negotiation. It was a psychological duel between fear and trust, between propaganda and lived experience, between a rigid code of death and a fragile offer of survival. On that beach with the Pacific wind cutting across volcanic sand, history paused. One teenager with broken Japanese was attempting something no doctrine had prepared for. He was not just asking them to surrender. He was asking them to believe him. And against every expectation of that brutal campaign, they began to believe. By mid-morning, the beach beneath Bonsai Cliff no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a fragile crossroads between life and annihilation. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians sat in uneasy clusters, watching the small Marine who stood before them. They had been told Americans were monsters. That surrender meant humiliation, torture, death. And yet the only American in sight was not shouting threats. He was speaking their language. Guy Gabaldon moved carefully through the growing crowd. He did not pace like a conqueror. He spoke like someone who understood fear. In broken but familiar Japanese, he talked about families, about mothers waiting at home, about fathers who worked long hours and worried about sons at war. He mentioned food, water, medical treatment. He promised humane treatment, not as a slogan, as a commitment. Some soldiers looked at him with suspicion. Others looked exhausted. Civilians clutched children tighter. The air was thick with doubt. This was not simply about survival, it was about pride, about the crushing weight of Bushido, about the shame they had been taught to fear more than death itself. Gabaldon did something rare in war. He acknowledged that fear. He did not mock it. He did not dismiss it. He countered it with familiarity. He spoke in the cadence of little Tokyo kitchens, in the rhythm of conversations he had once shared with the Nakano family. He did not sound like propaganda. He sounded human. That was the difference. Trust in war is almost impossible to build. It usually takes time, shared hardship, or overwhelming force. Gabaldon had none of those advantages. What he had was authenticity. The soldiers could hear it. They could sense that he was not improvising cruelty. He was offering a path out. One by one, the emotional barrier began to crack. Shoulders lowered. Weapons were placed on the sand. Parents whispered to children that they would not jump. The code of death was giving way to something older and more universal, the instinct to live. On that stretch of beach, empathy proved more powerful than artillery. And in that moment, the war in the Pacific shifted in a way few historians fully recognize. Not because territory changed hands, but because belief. The murmurs along the beach fell silent when he appeared. From the largest cave opening, a Japanese officer stepped into the light. His uniform was intact despite weeks of combat. A sword rested at his side. His posture was rigid, controlled, disciplined. He did not rush. He descended the narrow path, slowly, eyes fixed on the lone Marine waiting below. Guy Gabaldon felt the shift immediately. This was no frightened conscript. This was authority. If the officer rejected surrender, the fragile calm would shatter in seconds. Hundreds would retreat back into the caves. The cliffs would burn, and Gabaldon would likely die where he stood. The officer stopped roughly 20 feet away. Two men, no translators, no witnesses close enough to hear every word, just volcanic sand ocean wind and the weight of history between them. Gabaldon lowered his weapon slightly, but kept it ready. He spoke first in the same rough Japanese that had carried him this far. He did not insult. He did not threaten. He stated facts. American warships were offshore. Aircraft controlled the sky. Reinforcements were not coming. Continued resistance would mean the deaths of soldiers and civilians alike. The officer listened without expression. Then came the questions. How would prisoners be treated? Would soldiers be separated from civilians? Would the wounded receive medical care? Would personal belongings be stolen or destroyed? Each question was a test, not of firepower, but of credibility. Gabaldon answered steadily. Food, water, doctors. Weapons confiscated, but personal items respected. No torture, no executions, humane treatment under international law. He spoke not as a private, but as a representative of an entire nation. Behind them, more figures emerged from the caves. The beach was filling. The officer glanced at the growing crowd, then back at the Marine barely older than some of his own soldiers. For a long moment, nothing moved. In that pause, centuries of military doctrine hung in balance. Bushido demanded resistance. Pride demanded defiance. But leadership demanded survival. The officer gave a short nod. Then he turned and shouted commands in Japanese. The tension broke like a snapped wire. Men began descending in organized groups. Civilians followed. The duel had ended without a shot fired. Not because one side was stronger, but because one side had been convinced. On that beach, beneath the shadow of Bonsai Cliff, victory was not claimed through destruction. It was negotiated. When the negotiations ended, the real danger began. By late morning, the beach beneath Bonsai Cliff was no longer a standoff. It was a gathering of humanity. Soldiers sat in rows. Civilians huddled together. Wounded men lay supported by makeshift stretchers. The count kept rising. 600, 700. Nearly 800 souls now waited on volcanic sand, all having chosen life over death. And at the front of them stood one 18-year-old Marine. Guy Gabaldon understood the next threat was not from the caves. It was from his own side. American patrols had been trained to fire first at massed enemy formations. A column of hundreds of Japanese moving along open beach would look exactly like an attack. He had seconds to think and no manual to consult. Gabaldon climbed onto a rock and pulled off his white undershirt. He tied it to a broken tree branch, creating a crude surrender flag. He handed it to a Japanese soldier at the front of the column and gave simple instructions in Japanese. Hold it high, never stop waving. If it drops, everyone dies. The formation began to move north along the shoreline. The image was surreal. A single Marine in a baseball cap and aviator sunglasses leading a column of enemy soldiers and civilians in disciplined lines. The Pacific surf rolled beside them. Burned-out equipment lay scattered in sand. The war had paused, but it had not forgiven. Gabaldon stayed at the front carbine, visible but lowered. Every step was a calculation. If the prisoners panicked, the column would collapse. If one man bolted toward the jungle, suspicion would ignite. If American Marines spotted them from a distance, gunfire could erupt without warning. The beach stretched ahead in silence. 20 minutes of walking felt like hours. 800 people moving in fragile trust behind one teenager who knew that if a single mistake occurred, he would be the first to fall. Then in the distance, American figures appeared, rifles raised, defensive positions taken. The march of 800 souls was about to meet the instinct of war. History often remembers the roar of artillery. It rarely remembers moments like this. A white cloth tied to a branch, a column walking toward uncertain mercy, and a young Marine carrying not just a weapon, but the responsibility for every life behind him. The three Marines ahead did exactly what they had been trained to do. They saw a massive formation of Japanese troops moving in disciplined lines along the beach. Rifles were raised. Defensive positions taken behind rocks. From their vantage point, it looked like a final counterattack. Guy Gabaldon saw the shift instantly. He saw one Marine drop to a knee, another adjust his aim. The white cloth tied to the branch was visible, but small against the glare of volcanic sand. 800 prisoners stood behind him. One nervous trigger could turn that beach into a slaughter. He started waving both arms over his head. American prisoners, do not shoot." The wind swallowed some of his words. The Marine with the rifle kept aiming. Standard doctrine was clear: eliminate the threat before it closes distance. There was no time for long explanations in war. Gabaldon tore off his baseball cap and waved it high. He turned sideways so they could see the Marine Corps insignia on his uniform. He shouted his name, rank and unit. "Private Guy Gabaldon, 2nd Marines. These are prisoners." The rifle remained steady. 5 seconds. That was all it would take. 800 lives hung between fear and recognition. Behind him, the column remained still. The Japanese officer had ordered discipline. No running, no shouting. They waited knowing that panic would mean death. The Marine on point hesitated. The image did not make sense. A lone Marine at the front of an enemy column. No visible aggression. A white flag raised by one of the supposed attackers. He lowered his rifle slightly. Not fully, just enough. Gabaldon did not stop shouting. He stepped forward, hands raised higher, exposing himself completely. If a shot came, it would strike him first. He made himself the target so the men behind him would not be. The tension snapped. The Marine finally stood up from cover and began walking forward cautiously. The other two kept their weapons trained, but they did not fire. In that moment, the Pacific War could have taken a darker turn. Instead, it paused. Recognition replaced instinct. Communication overrode doctrine. The column of 800 continued forward, not as an advancing army, but as a procession of survival. History rarely records the seconds when disaster is avoided. Yet on that beach, in the space between a raised rifle and a lowered one, a different kind of victory was secured. After Saipan, Guy Gabaldon could have stepped back into anonymity. Instead, he carried his method to the next battlefield. In August 1944, U.S. forces moved south to Tinian, another volcanic stronghold that stood between America and the Japanese home islands. The pattern repeated: caves, hidden machine guns, scattered holdouts who refused to surrender. Gabaldon did what he always did. He approached the darkness and called out in Japanese: food, water, medical care, fair treatment. Some emerged, others waited. Then came the ambush. A Type 92 machine gun opened fire from an elevated position, cutting through palm trees and volcanic brush. Marines dove for cover. The jungle exploded with sound. This was not negotiation. This was lethal precision. Gabaldon spotted 3 Japanese soldiers attempting to flank his pinned patrol. If they reached grenade range, it would be over. He fired first, neutralizing the threat, but the explosion that followed gave away his position. The machine gun shifted. A burst tore through the vegetation. He felt it instantly. A searing impact just above his knee. A 7.7 millimeter round punched clean through his leg. He did not scream. He applied a tourniquet. He kept talking. Even wounded, he urged his fellow Marines to reposition to flank the gun nest. While the machine gun focused on suppressing his voice, 2 Marines maneuvered through cover and silenced the position with grenades. The stalemate broke. But for Gabaldon, the war had changed. Evacuated by stretcher, carried from jungle to beach to hospital ship, he watched the Pacific fade behind him. Doctors told him he would walk again, but his days in combat were over. He was 18 years old. In just weeks of fighting, he had captured more than 1,300 soldiers and civilians, more than any individual American serviceman in the Pacific theater. Yet the bullet at Tinian did more than wound muscle. It ended a chapter that had quietly reshaped how the United States understood psychological warfare. Gabaldon did not leave the battlefield in triumph. He left it in silence, carried away from the island where words had proven as powerful as weapons. More than a decade after the guns fell silent, Guy Gabaldon's story resurfaced not on a battlefield, but under studio lights. In 1957, he appeared on the television program This Is Your Life, where former Marines confirmed the impossible-sounding truth: one teenager had led hundreds out of caves and into surrender. America listened. For the first time, many believed. Hollywood followed. In 1960, the film Hell to Eternity hit theaters, inspired by Gabaldon's actions on Saipan. But when audiences looked at the screen, they did not see a 5'4" Mexican-American street kid from East Los Angeles. They saw Jeffrey Hunter, tall, blue-eyed, classically cast. The transformation was subtle but powerful. The story remained. The explosions remained. The heroism remained. But the face changed. Gabaldon served as a consultant during filming, correcting language, refining scenes, preserving fragments of truth. Yet even he understood the compromise. Studios wanted a leading man who fit the era's expectations. Marketable, familiar, comfortable to mainstream audiences. The irony cut deep. In war, he had proven that identity could bridge cultures. In peace, his own identity was reshaped to fit a different narrative. The film brought recognition. It pressured the Marine Corps to revisit his decorations. but it also revealed something about history itself. The line between memory and myth is often drawn by those who control the camera. Gabaldon did not lose his story, but he watched it retold in a form that softened its edges and adjusted its face. In doing so, Hollywood immortalized him and rewrote him at the same time. After the headlines faded and the cameras moved on, Guy Gabaldon made a choice few expected. He returned to Saipan, the very island where he had once stood alone beneath Bonsai Cliff. What had been a battlefield became his home for nearly 2 decades. He built a business, raised a family, walked the same beaches where 800 men once chose surrender over death. Japanese visitors sometimes approached him quietly. Some bowed. Some thanked him for keeping his word, for treating their fathers and grandfathers with dignity in a moment when despair ruled. That more than medals mattered. Gabaldon never stopped believing he deserved the Medal of Honor. He wrote letters, spoke to officials, advocated not only for himself, but for fairness in recognizing minority service members whose contributions had been overlooked. The upgrade never came. He died in 2006 and was buried with full military honors at Arlington. His Navy Cross rested above his folded flag. The Medal of Honor did not. Yet history is not measured only in decorations. Gabaldon proved that courage is not always loud. That sometimes the bravest act is to step forward with words instead of bullets. On an island defined by suicide cliffs and last stands, he offered another path, and hundreds followed him down.